Please join me in welcoming David and Andy.
All right, good morning. Katie, thank you very much for the introduction. We're excited to be here today to tell you about Nationwide's journey to operationalizing the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Like any good story, it started off with a lot of promise, this MITRE ATT&CK thing, how great this could be for our organization. And then we tried to do it in our own environment and realized how tough it was. And we tried our own ways and ended up realizing and going into despair as we realized we had no idea what we were doing and realizing the enormity of this situation. And getting to the point where we almost gave up on MITRE ATT&CK, almost threw it in the trash because we just didn't know how to figure out how to get value out of this. But then we stumbled upon this thing called intelligence. It kind of shed some light on how we could actually go about doing this, gave us some focus, gave us some prioritization, allowed us to see the light, to be able to seize the day, do all those famous things like slaying dragons, and ultimately being able to operationalize this within our own environment. So not quite a Hollywood story here, but we're really excited about the journey that we've been on over the last several years and to be able to talk to you today about that. But first, we're going to hit our introductions here.
I'm ATT&CK. I've been in IT security for the last 20 years and spent the last 4 in Nationwide Insurance in their Cybersecurity Operations Center. I'm also our attack champion, spreading all the goodness that we can do with attack.
Awesome. And David Weston, I spent 20 years as an intelligence officer in the Marine Corps, spent the last 4 years helping to stand up the capabilities at U.S. Cyber Command, ended up retiring at the end of 2017, joining Nationwide early in 2018, and have been there since then. So we also have a couple other folks that have been on this journey. One of the big key lessons that we learned, I think Tony mentioned it, was it can't just be a couple folks doing this. We've had quite the village that have helped us out over the last year in particular. One of our associates is actually across town right now giving a presentation at another conference, very similar to the presentation we're giving here, except focusing on the collection tools that we use in spending. We also have the Columbus Collaboratory. That's a group of 7 different companies, some of the largest companies in Columbus, Ohio, that banded together to focus on cybersecurity challenges. That's another topic, if anybody's interested offline, that we'd love to chat with you about. So we're going to start by focusing on how it didn't work, and I'm going to give this over to Andy.
Yeah, so like with many organizations, getting started with attack can be quite challenging. Understanding what attack is, who should we involve, how do we use this, is a few questions we wanted to answer. So we put together a project with the approach of looking at taking the MITRE techniques and lining them up with our security tools, and also the second focus of testing out our endpoints to identify any potential security threats. So we started off, so we started this project Squishy. It's a great name. Here's what we ended up doing is we had members from the attack and penetration team, as well as security tool engineers, coming together and performing some of these tests. Like any great road trip, we were high energy, excited. We had all the techniques, the MITRE framework. We had security tools to look at, and we had all these techniques we wanted to assess against. We started off testing each technique one at a time. We went very deep and very wide on those techniques. Sometimes knocking down lines of defenses on the endpoints and retesting it again and again. Great approach, very thorough, got a lot of good understanding of how the attack techniques operated. But then leadership started coming to us saying, are you done testing all the techniques? You've been doing this for a while. What are the results? And then we kind of started understanding a few months into the project that our current methodologies and approach, it will probably take several years going through this, and it wasn't working out. So for our first attempt, we learned a lot of what to do and what not to do with the MITRE framework. The primary thing is the lack of focus. When we got done with testing a technique, we went forward and grabbed another technique. No real rhyme or reason. Maybe it was something we heard in the news, some approach that someone on the A&P team wanted to test out. So we didn't really have that focus that really drove a lot of this. We also weren't really formalized in how we wanted to document this. So we went forward testing out a technique, and when we were done, we moved on to another one, but we really didn't capture consistently how the results were done. That also led to lack of participation, because while the attack and pen team was working on it, the other engineers were were participating, but they weren't able to be active in that project. So we had some participation fee that came up as well.
So by the summer of 2018, we'd been trying to operationalize MITRE ATT&CK for about 15 months, and and the attack framework was going nowhere at Nationwide, except maybe into the trash. We had no excitement around this framework. We had nobody really still understood what it could do for us. None of our leadership could find value in what we were trying to do. So I like stories. I think stories help embrace new concepts, especially tricky concepts. And one of the challenges we were having is we couldn't tell our story for what we were trying to do with ATT&CK. If you'd asked us what our story was for MITRE ATT&CK back in the summer of 2018, it would be something similar to this. Hey, boss, we've got this 240 some odd techniques that tell you everything that all threat actors are going to be able to do in our environment. We've kind of looked through those. I think we're pretty good against most of those techniques. We've got some other ones that we probably could work on. And we're going to go and we're going to deep dive into a couple techniques and see what we can come up with. Kind of boring, not really giving any excitement, not really giving what leadership needs, which is an understanding of what's going to affect him and his job, what's going to kind of get him in trouble. And so let's add that intelligence into there, and let's change the story. So if we came across, so we added intelligence, and our story started sounding like this. Hey, boss, our research indicates that there are 27 threat actors that are known to target similar peers in our finance and insurance industry. Those 27 threat actors are known to use 91 specific techniques in their attacks. Additionally, we can further prioritize those techniques based on widespread use and ease of execution. We're going to test those 91 techniques, and we're going to come up with mitigations and detections. We're going to implement those in environment to protect against the most likely threat actors that are facing our industry. That's a lot better story. That's something that tells to risk, that tells senior leadership, gets them excited about what's most likely to affect them and affect our company, and what's going to keep them safe, what's going to keep our company safe and keep our CISO's job safe. Okay, so the process that we ended up using at Nationwide was a 5-step process. We're going to talk heavily about the threat intelligence phase here, but there are 4 other phases, and I will tell you that the best thing to say is that once we figured out the threat intelligence phase, everything else kind of fell into place. And we'll talk about this slide here in a second, but really the threat intelligence phase was the roadmap that we used, and once we had that down, everything was pretty simple. So I talked a second ago about 27 threat actors. That's what we ended up with, that we were focused on at Nationwide, focused on the finance and insurance industry. How we got there was actually almost pure luck. In the summer of 2018, we had an intern, and we gave her a typical intern project. Hey, go figure out all the threats that could potentially affect Nationwide. So we did this project actually completely separate from MITRE ATT&CK, and if you remember at the time, MITRE ATT&CK for us was going nowhere. We were basically getting ready to scrap that. It turns out that putting those two together is when we realized that we had a lot of value for our organization. But so the 27 threat actors, so again, we gave this intern a project. She went out and she did a whole bunch of open source research trying to figure out, and she ended up finding the spreadsheet out there that had a couple hundred different threat actors. This spreadsheet had a number of different tabs based on geographic location. It had a whole bunch of columns that I think we mentioned, a threat actor has 12 or 13 other different names, so it had columns for those. It talked about the attacks that they were involved in, but it had a really neat column on there that talked about the industries that each of the threat actors were known to target. We saw that as something that we could be able to take advantage of in our organization. So we did a bunch more research. We fine-tuned that spreadsheet. We added a few threat actors that we knew about that weren't on there. We kind of cleaned up some of the work that was in there. We still had this big spreadsheet of data, and we're like, okay, so we need to make this more valuable to Nationwide. And that's where we came up with a scoring system like you see on the screen here. So this scoring system, again, it's very basic. All we did was we started taking a look at just kind of guessing at what each of the threat actors' capability and intent were. So intent for us, we're a US-based company. So if the threat actor was targeting overseas and not targeting anywhere in the US, we're not going to care about it as much. If they're targeting, if they're financially motivating, we'll give them a point. If they're targeting the finance industry, we'll give them a point. If they're targeting the finance and insurance industry, we'll give them a point. If they're targeting Nationwide, we'll give them a whole bunch of points. Point is that it wasn't very scientific. It was kind of name, let's go throw a number on there, and we really didn't worry so much about being exact on that. Same thing with capability. As we went through our research, as we were studying the different threat actors, if somebody had come out and said, this is a really capable threat actor, these are very sophisticated threat actors, we'll give them more points. If they were saying they're kind of more script kiddie-like, we wouldn't give them a lot of points. And ultimately, if they had additional resources behind them, we'll give them a few more points, again, on a scale of 1 to 5. And then we aged off that number. So if we hadn't seen a threat actor, any activity in the last 6 months, 12 months, et cetera, we'd start taking away half a point here and half a point there. So that way, we didn't end up with our top threat actor being somebody that nobody's heard of since 2011. So ultimately, we have this great spreadsheet now. It still isn't, we've got a whole bunch of numbers on it, but it still isn't telling a full story. So what we realized is we needed to do what any self-respecting Intel shop would do, which is we put it into a chart.
It is a very pretty chart indeed. Here's where we actually taken threat intelligence and visualize the threat actors, and we can now quickly learn a lot about our adversaries. One thing we picked up was a great aha moment is that they were evenly spread across the chart, and they weren't clustered in any one central area. This is also the first time we're able to take threat intelligence and the MITRE ATT&CK framework and start bringing awareness to our security teams and to our leadership, who especially like the chart because now it really brought home almost a face to some of these threat actors that are operating against us. As many security professionals, we want to sit there and try to evaluate every single technique, every single threat, every single tool. Following this approach, we're now able to take that down to the top 27 threat actors that are operating against us. We're able to look at the TTPs that they're using, and we want to give those the highest prioritization and understanding of how they're working against us. So now we're armed with a focus. We know who we're going to go after, and we know who we're looking into, and we can move on to the what.
So to get to what, we went back to the MITRE ATT&CK website. Great resource to be able to pull down the techniques that are associated with each of these threat actors. So we went there. We went to the attack. What is the drawing a blank on
Navigator.
that? But the navigators. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And went to the navigator. You put in a threat actor. It gives you all the techniques associated with that. Pin 7. There's 22 different techniques that are associated with them. So we did that, but we realized that with 27 threat actors, not all of them were on the MITRE ATT&CK site. So we had to do a lot of research ourselves. We used our own intelligence collection service. We use Recorded Future, but any of the other typical intelligence collection services are going to be able to give you a similar capability, to be able to dive into each one of the threat actors, to be able to understand the anatomy of how they attacked, and then to understand the techniques associated with that. So we spent a lot of time. We grabbed research from ATT&CK, from our friends in the Columbus Collaboratory, from Twitter, from anywhere we could find it. We threw it all together into a big pile. Well, again, we're not so worried about being right or wrong so much as we're trying to just get as much information on each of these threat actors as possible. So we tried to put it into attack. We started off by trying to put everything into Attack Navigator, realized that we wanted to shape the data a little bit differently. We wanted to be able to put a heat map for the widespread use of certain techniques. So we exported all of that into a spreadsheet because we like spreadsheets, and we ended up with something that looks like this. So all of the yellow on there were where we had 1 or 2 threat actors that were using a technique. The ones that are closer to red, we had more threat actors that were using those techniques, up into things like PowerShell. I think 8 or 9 the threat actors that we had noted were using that technique. But it's still kind of clunky. It's still a little bit messy here. We're still not being able to tell the full story. And the problem is that you're still talking this huge spreadsheet, and it's still cluttered with a bunch of information on here. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to remove all of the techniques that we're not going to focus on. And now you get what I think Blake had mentioned earlier about not being able to put all your MITRE ATT&CK on one slide. We've got our MITRE ATT&CK on one slide. These are the things that we care about at our organization. And the neat thing on this one is I've actually presented this up to our CIO as far as on a PowerPoint slide similar to this. And it's something unlike, as everybody else struggles with, trying to get this, what a MITRE ATT&CK looks like in one area. But most importantly, we have a manageable project. So we started with 240 plus techniques, and we had no idea where to start with on that. Now we have 91 techniques. We've some tactics that only have 4 techniques that we need to focus on. This is something that you can actually get into. It's kind of like just you're taking that first bite of the apple. You need to be able to take it before you can move on, and this enabled us to do that. So, in our mind, this was the most important thing for us, was to get to this point. Once we had 91 techniques, everything else, to my favorite action character growing up, G.I. Joe, we had the information, and knowing is half the battle, and quite honestly, that's true. So the next thing we need to do is we need to actually put that into the rest of our process. So we talked about a 5-step process that we had. Once we had this, everything else really just kind of fell right into place. So the next thing that we did with each one of those 91 techniques was we tested those. So we have an attack and penetration team at Nationwide that we ended up using to test these, but quite honestly, the Red Canary, Atomic Red Team scripts were used on a great majority of these to be able to test. So you don't necessarily need your own attack and penetration to do this. As we tested these, we realized that there were some things that did work in our environment. There were some things that didn't work in our environment. For those that our attack team was able to execute in our environment, we went back to the MITRE ATT&CK site, pulled down the recommendations for mitigations and detections. Each recommendation we put onto a separate line onto our spreadsheet, because we like spreadsheets. And we then used that, and we started working with our infrastructure folks and started talking to them hey, in our environment, can we execute this recommendation? If we can execute this recommendation, we did. If we could not, we pushed, we modified that in some way that would work for us. So a lot of the recommendations were secure config recommendations, very easy to do in our environment. There were other ones that we couldn't do because of the way our network is set up. And there were still others that we realized if we put them together into a big project, we could actually get resourcing and funding for that. And because we were able to talk and tell a story about how this has impacted, that these are threat actors that are specifically targeting our industry, made it a lot easier to get the funding to be able to get those projects started. Then the last thing that we did was the leadership phase. In the first go-around, we kept everything very close hold. We actually classified a lot of the data that was coming out of there, and so only a few people actually knew what was going on. Well, only a few people knowing what's going on doesn't get people excited about what we're doing here with MITRE ATT&CK. We split the script for this time. We told everybody. We had weekly updates where we would share, here are the techniques that we tested, here's what we were successful on, what we were not successful on, here are the mitigations, detections, and here's what we're doing about that. We had monthly meetings with executive leaders where they had an opportunity to help ask questions and understand what this MITRE ATT&CK thing was and how we were implementing it in our environment. And when we were done with the first testing phase, we said we need to go on a roadshow. So we spent 2 months going throughout Nationwide talking about MITRE ATT&CK, talking about all the different techniques, walking through each one of those techniques, the 91 techniques, and showing them where we're protecting Nationwide against the most likely threat actors to target our industry. And then we also took it on the road to outside of Nationwide. You see us here. We've also got somebody over at another conference talking about ATT&CK. We're excited about it, but that was really one of the things that we found was very beneficial for operationalizing this. So where did we end up with all of this? With a lot of work. So there was a lot of recommendations that came out of the work that we did. We've implemented a lot of those. We still have a number of projects that we're working on right now. But most importantly, we ended up with a change in our culture. So if you had asked me 18 months ago what our culture was at Nationwide, I'd tell you it was a compliance-based culture. We worried about audits. We worried about regulations. If you ask me today, we talk about intelligence-driven operations. We focus on what is the most important threats to our environment, and we actually go out and we start making our security controls are covering against those most likely threats. That is a huge change, and that's all because of what we did with MITRE ATT&CK, and because we started prioritizing, and because we focused our efforts just on those 91s, just on those threat actors and techniques that were targeting our network. So are we done? No, so we've got a whole bunch more that we're doing, and I'm going to show you a few things. So Andy showed you that chart that we had earlier that had a whole bunch of threat actors. That was just a first go. We winged it. I'm not going to try to lie up here. We basically just said, hey, let's just throw this out and see what happens and what sticks. So over the time, we've refined that. We've gotten down to a better understanding of certain threat actors that are targeting us. Well, we threw this up about 6 months ago. This specific one, we're still refining from there. But we realized that obviously with MITRE coming out with new techniques, with threat actors coming out with new techniques, we always have to iterate through this, and we did so. We So we had 19 new techniques that came out of this, the time that we updated this chart, went ahead and tested those, mitigated and put in new mitigations and detections on those, and we're constantly reviewing that monthly and a quarterly basis. We talked earlier about prioritization of the techniques. So we talked about widespread use as the first way that we prioritize. We've gone back and we've looked at it again. We said, hey, not only widespread use, ease of execution, how dangerous is it in our environment? That's led us to a 1 to 91 ranking of the techniques in our environment. And we've added the 19 new ones that we've done now. But what this does is this enables us to have that conversation. Now I can have a conversation if there's 2 different projects that need funding or 2 different projects that need resources. Was that project dealing with one of these top couple of techniques, or was it dealing with one that's 89 or 90 on the ranking chart? I'm sure going to get the funding for the top 5 than I was before. This is something that we didn't have before. We couldn't have those conversations, and quite honestly, we were spending a lot of time focusing on techniques that didn't matter to us at Nationwide. And so now we actually, every single time we talk about new projects, we talk about in prioritization, where does that rank as far as priority?
Intelligence driving security. This is an area that has me excited the most. As a lot of us receive our news from the intelligence feeds, it's typically just threat actors, what they're doing, maybe some malware, what's happening there, and a little story of what happened. Like they get into an environment, the normal stories that we typically hear. Here, we're taking that intelligence and we're combining it with the attack framework to capture a strong message that goes across our entire organization. There, the attack framework is now a common language. We still have the information about what the attack is. We still maybe include a visual representation of how the attack was executed. But now we lay out technique by technique how that attack was performed. This is invaluable. Here we have an anatomy of a breach, an example we try to use, and we hand that off to one of our security engineers. Our security engineers, they know our environment. They know our security tools. They know our lines of defense. Taking an information like this, intelligence-driven, and adding MITRE to that, they can quickly start looking at where do I need to step in, where can I implement the kill chain? And we found that to be a huge success. Yeah. So key takeaways. Lessons learned from the first project helped drive some of the behaviors in this successful project that we took on. The key one there is focus. You have to have focus. Documentation of how we're going to do the assessment process was key, and involving a large team of people. I know one of our feedback we heard from the first project is that like the attack and pen team would go off and do a finding and throw that on to our IT organization. Here in this project, they were on board day one. We were engaging them, we were asking them questions on how should this attack work, and we were also spreading the good news about what attack can do for them. So the other key takeaway too is involve leadership. When they're on board on a weekly basis, and we had like quarterly readouts too of like major findings or recommendations we come up with, but involving them on a constant basis was invaluable.
All right, so that's our story. I think we got a couple minutes if there's anybody that has any questions.
Thanks for sharing that. So as you implemented these 91 attack controls, did you get any other benefits? Like did the red team quit because they couldn't hack into anything more? Did you get more visibility in the SOC, too many alerts? What were some of the other effects?
For us, the effects is just, for a lot of the changes we had to implement, those teams are overwhelmed. They have a lot of news coming at them, a lot of changes they have to look at doing. Here we're saying, hey, I need these recommendations done because we have 27 threat actors that are operating in finance, insurance sector that are coming at us. So help prioritize the work they need to do. And it's also wasn't one of those audit driven, oh, we have a finding, oh, we got to solve it. It's like, hey, this is a real world type of attack that's coming at us. So that helped drive the behavior and thinking. Before they're thinking like, oh, I got to go and implement this in a casual time frame. They felt engaged. They thought they were on board in the whole process. So.
I think that's the most exciting thing is that people believe in what they're doing. They believe in why they need to make these changes to the environment. So before we did this, we would get a lot of pushback from our infrastructure folks. We're adding work to their workload. Now we're talking about, hey, this is an actual threat to your environment. It's not just a regulatory piece or audit. This is an actual threat actor that is known to target this area. and we're putting in controls to stop that. That tells a much better story for them. It gives them much more excitement and reason to act and act quickly.
Like one of your, there we go. It seems like one of your successes was filtering according to industry. I was wondering if you think maybe that's something the community can add to Navigator, where just like we can break it down into threat actors, maybe we could all help gather intel and break it into industries to help others get past that learning curve, maybe.
Yeah, I'll let Miter take that one on for action. But I mean, obviously one of the biggest concerns by doing this is, there are 266 now techniques. What about those other? I can't do public math, but 266 minus 91 is a lot. What are we doing with all of those techniques? And so what we don't want to do necessarily is make sure that we're forgetting about those other ones. And that's kind of the sequel to some of the stuff we're doing, is we're going back and we're going through some of those other techniques. So I wouldn't necessarily, I'd be a little hesitant because of the, it gave us a start, but we still need to go through some of the other techniques.
I'll jump in with my MC privilege as the attack team and say it's really tough because sometimes in the open source reports we do from the attack team side, those industries aren't always identified. So you're going to be hearing from my colleague John Wonders when we talk about an exciting effort called Attack Sightings, where hopefully we can get some of that industry data to do something along the lines of what you asked about. All right, so we're at time. Thank you, Andy and David, for a great talk.